Welcome to LatinoAmericans with your host and narrator, Jacqueline Torres.
Everything you need to know about Latino history by the author Himilce Novas. She is an expert in Latino history, culture, literature, and human rights. We will start today with what was the Roosevelt Corollary. The ink had hardly dried on the Treaty of Paris ending the Spanish-American War when the issue of European intervention in the Western Hemisphere again took center stage. As the 20th century dawned, European governments began to exert pressure on several Latin American countries to repay their debts. For instance, after the Venezuelan government, plagued by civil discord and gross mismanagement, defaulted on loans to foreign bondholders in 1902, the British, Italians, and Germans dispatched a joint naval expedition to Venezuela, which blockaded and shelled the country's ports. Concerned that the blockading powers were ignoring the Monroe Doctrine's message and were competing with the United States for dominance in the Western Hemisphere, and invariably emboldened by the recent American victory against Spain and the acquisition of its remaining colonies, President Teddy Roosevelt unveiled in his annual address to Congress in 1904 the Roosevelt Corollary, which served as an amendment to the Monroe Doctrine and went one step further, some say one step too far. While the Monroe Doctrine was meant to curb European intervention in the Western Hemisphere, the Roosevelt Corollary outlined the active role that the United States, and no other nation but the United States, was obliged to play in the region. In this document, President Roosevelt first dismissed any charge that the United States was suffering from, quote, land hunger, end of quote, or entertaining, quote, any projects as regards the other nations of the Western Hemisphere, save such as are for their welfare, end of quote. The key phrase here is, quote, save such as are for their welfare, end of quote. For Roosevelt then declares that the United States has every right to act as, quote, an international police power wherever chronic wrongdoing or an impotence which results in a general loosening of the ties of civilized society ultimately require intervention by some civilized nation, end of quote. In other words, the United States had the right to intervene unilaterally in the affairs of any country in the hemisphere because the United States, was, quote, civilized, end of quote, and the rest of the nations in the region were not. In the century that lay ahead, this belief in American supremacy and exceptionalism would precipitate more U.S. intervention in Latin America, involving even the overthrow of governments deemed harmful to American investments and the installation of puppet rulers who would follow the policies outlined by Washington. To many Latin Americans at the turn of the century, the Roosevelt Corollary packed a wallop. U.S. imperialism had reached its zenith and was quite a force to be reckoned with. Who was Eugenio Maria de Hostos, and why is a college in New York City named after him? Eugenio Maria de Hostos was a Puerto Rican journalist, philosopher, educator, writer, and freedom fighter. Born in Mayagüez, Puerto Rico in 1839, he studied law and education in Spain, where he worked alongside other students for the cause of Puerto Rico's and Cuba's liberation from Spanish rule. In 1869, after Spain's Republicans were victorious over the monarchy, but then refused to fulfill their promise of autonomy for Puerto Rico and Cuba, Hostos left Spain and took up temporary residence in New York City, where he published a prominent revolutionary newspaper, La América Ilustrada. In 1875, after participating in efforts by Cubans to secure their independence from Spain, Eugenio Maria de Hostos went to the Dominican Republic, where he continued his fight for self-determination for the Spanish Caribbean colonies of Puerto Rico, Cuba, and the Dominican Republic, publishing the newspaper Las Tres Antillas, which was devoted to the issue. Hostos favored an Antilles confederacy in which the three colonies would be united as a kind of commonwealth. When the Spanish-American War erupted, Hostos returned to Puerto Rico, where he organized the League of Puerto Rican Patriots and steered a commission that presented President William McKinley with a plan that would afford Puerto Ricans the right to decide by means of a plebiscite whether they wanted independence or annexation by the United States. However, when U.S. ambassadors met with Spanish delegates to negotiate the end of the Spanish-American War and the fate of Spain's colonies, the few Puerto Rican officials whom Hostos had convinced the United States to invite to the table were granted no say in the final outcome. With the Treaty of Paris of 1898 ending the Spanish-American War, Puerto Rico became a U.S. protectorate with fewer rights to self-government than it had enjoyed in recent years under Spain. His dream of independence dashed. In 1900, Hostos left Puerto Rico. Aside from his political and journalistic career, Hostos dedicated himself to pedagogical pursuits, believing that only through educational opportunity could an oppressed people rise and be liberated. In 1879, he founded the first normal school in the Dominican Republic, where he inherited the title El Maestro, the teacher or the master. Later, after he migrated to Chile, he was named president of the Chilean Athenaeum, headed two schools, taught constitutional law at the Universidad de Chile in Santiago de Chile, and fought for women's right to equal access to that very same institution of higher learning. A prolific writer, Hostos penned approximately 50 volumes in the course of his lifetime, including the 1863 socio-political novel entitled La Peregrinación de Bajoan, The Pilgrimage of Bajoan, and the 1887 political treatise Lecciones de Derecho Constitucional, Lessons on Constitutional Rights. Eugenio María de Hostos died in the Dominican Republic in August 1903, 1 year after Cuba gained its independence. He never saw his dreams for an independent Puerto Rico realized. Eugenio María de Hostos Community College in the Bronx, New York, which was formed in 1968 at the urging of Puerto Rican and other Latino leaders, is named in Hostos' honor and holds fast to the philosophy of, quote, progress through education, close quote, which he so vigorously espoused.
Thank you for listening to Latino Americans with your host and narrator, Jacqueline Torres.